Hi, everyone. Good morning. And firstly, it's a pleasure to be back in BC again, particularly in Vancouver, which is the most beautiful city. I have a couple of slides I was going to use, but I changed my mind about 15 minutes ago about how I was going to do this. So you're just going to have to roll with me a bit, because I'd like to involve you or start to spark the dialogue on this. And the second thing is, I'm not going to stay standing on this because I'm not used to seeing the ground so far away from me because of my stature. So when I walked into the building this morning, and I was pretty gobsmacked. I've actually walked by this building quite a few times when I've been in Vancouver, and I've often looked inside and I thought, I wonder what it's like inside. It's one of those things that you sometimes do. I don't know if I'm the only one in the room who's ever done that, then I apologize. But anyway, this morning I walked in and I was completely gobsmacked by how well, firstly, what the building is, and then secondly, how it had been resculpted and repurposed as a building. And Siobhan mentioned that I should go downstairs to look at the vaults very quickly, so I went down to look at the old vaults downstairs. And you see these old vaults where they obviously locked up all the cash. And this building was built in 1916. It was commissioned in 1916, and it was finalized in 1916, so it's almost 100 years old. And it started off as a bank. And if you read the history on the left-hand side of the vault downstairs, you see the history of the world, right up to the bank closing its doors in 2000. And you actually see the future of Vancouver in the history of the world that it shows. And I'm going to try and take you on that journey and then bring you to some recommendations that I'm going to leave you with to think about, all in 10 minutes. So you've got to hold on. This is going to be fast, right? Okay. So if we think about when the building was built, 1916, we're in the middle of the First World War. It is not a good time. And I wasn't around at that time, but David tells me that in those days, actually nation-states were the preeminent states of the world, and how you traded was primarily done in the nation-state context. So you traded with your neighbor, and you sometimes crossed the border, but mostly you traded. This is right, David, you did mention this to me around 1916, yeah. And investment flows were only based on natural resources because you needed them, but pretty much that was the only flow that existed in nations. And there was this evolution over the last 100 years where we've started to see economic supply chains starting to intermingle, and you saw aberrations of growth in some countries over another. But all of these have started to change. And by the time the bank shut its doors here, having gone through a series of mergers and changing events over its life cycle from 1916, in 2000 we can think seminally that we had started the internet boom. And it had started to change how business was configuring. But actually the truth is that business had already started to change. Supply chains had started to become interdependent, and there was an equalization impact happening around the world where capital and labor was starting. We thought about low-cost economies, and we still talked about it, but it was the beginning of a process where you started to see costs of capital and labor starting to equalize. No matter what the global international institutions tried to do to stop it, it was happening, and competitive advantage started to change. So by the time the bank shut its door, and I think it was about 4 to 6 years before the university finalized the building and moved in here, we'd seen actually a seismic shift. In 1916, we don't have the numbers, but again, relying on David's anecdotes from when he was a teenager, he tells me in 1916, we think that in truth, companies, thousands and thousands of companies were responsible for global trade, because they were just trading locally. By the time the bank had shut its doors in 2000, we were pretty much sure that the top 500 companies in the world were actually controlling about 60% of global trade. The top 500. And their supply chains were driving economic prosperity for everybody else. And that's an astonishing statistic, except when we look at 2014, the top 500 companies in the world controlled 72% of global trade. It didn't decrease, it increased. And what did we see was we were seeing a concentration and an interdependency globally of supply chains between various countries as they built up their capacity and realized that they needed to coexist and cooperate with each other to enable prosperity. Now I want to leave that thought for a second, and I'm going to move into another thought piece around that. Once the supply chain started to work, it started to change the dynamics of how the companies who were part of these supply chains started to think. Because if you come back to my earlier point about how we saw capital and labor costs equalizing, When capital and labour starts to equalise, and this process, by the way, will continue. I mean, we might have sat in this room 10 years ago and thought China is a low-cost economy, South America is a low-cost economy, but they no longer are. Their costs are rising faster than Western costs were rising between 1920 and 1945, actually. So equalisation is on its way, and you've got to deal with it. And when you're in a world of equalisation, what is the commodity or what is the factor that really matters? Does anybody have any idea? Productivity. And what gives you productivity? So it's a great answer. We didn't set this up, by the way, but it's a great answer. Thank you. I was actually thinking, I hope someone says innovation or productivity. What gives you productivity? Ideas. We live in a world where ideas are the precious commodity now. They are the raw materials of how commerciality is done in institutions and companies. And people often say to me, that can't be true. That's an observation that doesn't work, Colin, because actually, you know, we see large companies and they seem to be very productive and very innovative and they come up with their own ideas themselves. Actually, they don't. I've written a paper which was published 3 weeks ago, just before the general election in the UK, which got me into a lot of trouble, which was saying that productivity and ideas are only driven by two factors: small companies and governments. The reasons are governments are the ultimate risk takers in developing new ideas, and anybody wants to ask me about that later on, please do, but I've got lots of evidence to back that. But if we look at the year 2000, when we look at companies like Google, Facebook, or we look at some of the new life science companies when they were small, just look at the number of acquisitions they've made since that period of time. Why are they making those acquisitions? They need ideas. The world needs ideas. Ideas are the value-adding creating entity. So we've got this equalization of capital and labor. We've got this interdependency globally with companies driving the major supply chains. And we know it's all about ideas, and it's going to become more and more important as time goes by. The second wave that we're very, very clear about since 1916, when this bank opened, is that urbanization is becoming critical. I don't know if anybody in the room has ever come across Alvin Toffler. Yeah, so we all know what age you guys are, because you're more or less the same age as me. Toffler in Future Shock, which I still think is a very defining book. I don't know if you remember back, he describes a world where, because of the changes that are happening and the interdependencies of nations, city-states become critical. And we see that already. Urbanization is driving people into cities, and cities are sharing characteristics that are more in common with each other than they are within the nation states that they look at, right? Now, I was going to test this with an analogy, but actually it's not true because you can't get good espresso in Vancouver. But in most cities in the world, people share things like the types of coffee they like to drink, the type of clothing they like to wear. So the cities are creating this homogeneity, and they actually look more like each other. And this was Toffler's hypothesis, that it doesn't matter what your genetic disposition is, it doesn't matter what your country bucket is, actually cities start to make themselves look more like each other, and they want to interact with each other, and urbanization is driving that, and more trade of these top 500 companies that control 72% of global trade is going to be driven through these city constructs. And whether, I'm from the countryside, by the way, so I'm not a city person. And sometimes when people say this to me, I think, well, that's really harsh because us country folk have something to contribute. Actually, of course we do. I'm not having that conversation right here right now, and I'm observing the fact that cities are becoming the correlation. So let's try and tie these three strands together. We know that the world is becoming more equal in terms of cost structures. We think ideas are the primary driver of productivity, they're the primary driver of innovation, and everybody seeks it, and these companies absolutely need it. And the third thing is that city-states are becoming very critical in their interaction between each other in terms of how these companies will interact globally. So I've painted that picture, and I want us to think now in the last 3 to 4 minutes about what that means to Vancouver. Because to me, I'm very fortunate in that Kelly and Siobhan and Pau have had me here a couple of times. And the one thing that strikes me about Vancouver in this equalization world, where ideas are important, is that you people have ideas. Your research centres, anytime I come across them, are excellent. We heard earlier about how good your academic institutions are. You build ideas, and ideas are the valuable, precious concentrate of future global economic prosperity. Costs can be done elsewhere. The thing about headquarters projects is that you have to remember you don't have to be doing everything. You just have to be owning it, supporting it, controlling it, and directing it. And if you think about that picture for a second, it tells me that this project is a very important project to take place at this point in time because you've got a lot of the collateral already in place. Your challenge is unfortunately about your inner limits and not the outer limits, because the world is saying to you, okay, we're interested in who's got the ideas, we're interested in who's got the human resource capacity, and we're interested in who can combine this together for us. That's what they're saying. The challenge back to you is, can you combine and unlock all these capabilities you have to ride these waves? And that's not going to be about understanding the trends that I've just talked about. It's about you collectively as a group of as a group of government ministries, as a group of private companies, as a group of academic institutions, putting together a cocktail that meets the demands of these times. And that is a fantastic opportunity for you to be positioned in. Because if we went back to when this bank opened in 1916, you were pretty much played the card that you got. If you came from a peripheral economy and you had natural resources, well done. If you came from a peripheral economy like I did, which had no natural resources, you were snookered. We now live in a world where it's become more equal. We can now create ideas that can move around the world and create tremendous value, and we can own supply chains from a geography that historically would have been considered peripheral or out of the mainstream. So the opportunity is ripe. I think the initiative of HQ Vancouver, and David will speak more to London's experience of this because London's been there a lot longer and it's tried this before, tells you that the opportunity is there. The only question that we have to address is, can you overcome any inner limits? By that I mean any restrictions you've put on yourselves to build a combination of capabilities, because you've already got them, that unlock these global opportunities for you. You can be a gateway to Asia in very specific areas. Not in everything, by the way, so let's not get carried away here. You target those areas and you can build these corridors of success into the future. You have the capability, you have the raw materials in terms of people, skills, research. The question is, can we combine these to unlock it? And what we have seen in Vancouver and what we've seen in British Columbia is the ability to do that. We have seen islands of where there are fantastic resonances occurring, where you create opportunities that are globally recognized and could be maximized even further. And that's a fantastic place to be in this kind of world right now. So although people were sad when this bank shut its door in 2000, I guess some people were sad anyway, I imagine. Look what's happened. You've repurposed the building to become this type of institute of learning, this type of institute that can actually have a global connection to the rest of the world. So the history of this building pretty much tells me a lot about the opportunity that confronts you here. And later on, if we have time, I'd like to explore the type of things I think you should be doing around that. But the one key thing I think you should take from this, the one overriding message is, have the confidence to overcome your inner limits and start talking to those companies that want to globalize, because you can be part of their pathway to globalization. Thank you.